In this lecture, what we're going to talk about is some of the strategies that you might use to approach Bernadette Mayer's memory. And I'm going to show you some of the kinds of things that you can look out for as you're reading the text. Memory is a very sort of, what would be the word? Famous is maybe not quite the right word, but memory is a much celebrated literary project of the 1970s. I think it was originally written in 1971. And it's taken many forms over the years. And part of the difficulty of the project is that it, in its initial conception, involved not only tape-recorded language, but also written language and photographs, all arranged within a gallery space. And the text itself, with the images here, this is the first time that an edition of the book has been published that contains a significant portion of the images that Mayer shot for the project. She shot, I think, a whole roll of film every day of the month of July in either 1971 or 1970, right? Yeah, it says it encompasses a month of July 1971. And so one of the things that can be a little overwhelming with the text is that it has a sort of continuous flow of discourse throughout. And there's not a lot of breakage. There's the points where they mark off different days or different moments or different sections within a day. But by and large, ordinary punctuation and paragraph structure are not present. So one of the things that we need to do is find ways to carve out moments from this stream of poetry and think about ways that we can read them, understand them, and use them as part of our larger investigation of postmodern poetics. So Mayer is sort of a strange figure, and you'll get this by reading both the chapter from Nelson's book on the women of the New York School and other something abstractions, I forget the title exactly, as well as the chapter from Vickery's Leaving Lines of Gender. Nelson is considering Mayer as part of the New York School, and she does touch on the way that Mayer gets attached to the language writers. Whereas Vickery is trying to situate Mayer much more as a precursor to the language writers or even an early participant. And the thing that you'll note in Vickery's account especially is that she points out that other folks like Susan Howe and Lynn Heginian resented in some ways the way that Mayer was easily foregrounded in a lot of discussions of language writing, whereas many of the women who were active participants in the formation of language writing did not get as much discussion, right? Mayer has had a strange career. So she started, and you can see in the way that memory unfolds that the text captures the process of the production of the text. So there's definitely a connection there to things like Ashbery's self-portrait and convex mirror and O'Hara's lunch poems and so on and so forth. In the way that the text seeks to record the process of its own emergence. But Mayer, as a second-generation New York School poet, and one who actually was pretty close friends with Clark Coolidge for a while, has a much more radical approach to language than many of the first-generation New York School writers had. So whereas O'Hara, takes everyday experience and the things that he's encountering on the street, and then he brings them together and pulls this thematic piece like Lana Turner has collapsed out of it. Mayer includes everything, and she is less preoccupied with the poem as a discrete unit, at least in the beginning of her career, right? And many of her books towards the beginning of her career were cast as poetry, but they appeared in prose. And so this was another thing that the language writers liked, especially the grand poobah language writers like Ron Silliman, who tried to elevate sort of prose poetry as the particular mode of language writing, though that's not really accurate. That's Ron Silliman's take. But as Mayer progressed, as she went through the end of the 70s and into the 1980s, she produced several other large conceptual projects like Memory. She did Midwinter's Day, The Desire of Mothers to Please Others in Letters, which used time-based constraints on writing. Midwinter Day was the poetic record of an entire day. The Desire of Mothers is the 9 months that she was pregnant with one of her children. And so she did some of those radical things, and then she started to move more into shorter poems that were more, at least on the surface, conventional. And so the language writers, sort of drifted away from that, even, because suddenly Mayer wasn't doing, the kinds of things that they thought she should be doing. She stopped doing these long experiments and started doing things that were a little more lyrical, right? That they still have a very Mayer-esque flavor. And so one of the things to note is that she never really comfortably, like she starts in the New York school, sort of gets into language writing, or is sort of along parallel tracks with language writing for a while, and then she gets much more New York school as she goes on. In the 80s and 90s and even up until today. And so she really isn't purely of either realm. She's almost her own thing entirely, right? But her texts not only capture the process of their own composition, but they also invite participation in reading. So Memory, Midwinter Day, Desire of Mothers to Please Others in Letters, these big experiments leave a lot of room for the reader to figure out strategies for moving through the text and figuring out how to process what the text is doing. And I'm going to offer you a couple of different ways you can do that. But one of the big questions that Mayer is pursuing is the relationship between experience and writing, and between representation and experience. So in other words, when we go out in the world, we have experiences. We have sensory experiences, intellectual, emotional, spiritual experiences, things that happen to us. And then that has to be processed into language in order to be written. We have to find a way to represent it. And as we've talked about throughout this course, the possibility of representing something directly is always fraught, because language always has that baggage. I mean, it's like that Bakhtin quote, right? Our language is always already populated by others' intentions. We can't use a word unless it's already been used before and has some sort of social agreement on what it means. And so it's tricky business to achieve any sort of transparency or any sort of direct communication of energy, as Olson would say, between the poet and the reader, because there's this necessary screen between us, right? And so Mayer was interested in a way that is reminiscent of, but radically different from, the confessional poets. So the confessional poets, just in the way that like O'Hara would process his everyday experience into a poem, the confessional poets with their authenticity effects and their pretensions to transparency, though they knew that they were not being transparent, would attempt to simulate traumatic mental states and intimate moments, and try to achieve an effect of intimacy through poetic means. Yeah. So you'll note, for instance, like Sylvia Plath's rich metaphors and her almost electric neon images, or Anne Sexton's subtle use of meter and rhyme. Yeah. So the poetry orders the experience, and so we know that it's not 100% transparent. Mayer is trying to similarly write out of her life, but as a second-generation New York school poet, sort of, she's writing about a quotidian experience, not necessarily trauma, not necessarily, some sort of quiet desperation, but just stuff that's happening. Midwinter Day, she's like, okay, I'm going to pick a day in the midwinter, and then I'm going to write this poem through it. Or with memory, she's like, I'm going to choose a month, the month of July, and then I'm going to write a poem. And of course, the decision to write a poem that way during that month is going to shape what one does in that month, right? It's going to inform the way that you go through the world. But the way that she's trying to write it is in such a way as to capture the entirety of the flow of consciousness and experience and sentience, right? And so she's hearkening back to this kind of Whitmanian impulse to include everything. Like if you've read Leaves of Grass, and the way that Whitman, over the course of the 19th century, from the 1850s through the 1890s, constantly revised and added to and modified his one book, right? It's not the only book he wrote, but I mean, you know what I mean. And so in Whitman's writing, one of his parts of his project, like from Song of Myself, where he says, do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself. I'm large, I contain multitudes. He's pursuing this sort of Emersonian transcendental I, right? He wants to become the transcendental I and to serve as sort of a conduit or channel. Forgive the background noise. My cats are engaged in some kind of commando action. Tries to become the transcendental I that can channel and speak America, right? That can speak all of America into being, right? Or not even into being, but can speak the complexity of that, right? So he's an I, but one that contains within himself contradiction. And obviously, there are myriad colonial and just generally hubristic dimensions to Whitman's project, yeah? But the idea was to write this enormous poem that would be the poem of America and that would capture the vast, complex, conflicted, contradictory substance of America, right? And that was what Whitman was trying to do, right? So for Whitman, the transcendental I in those moments serves as sort of a locus. He's got a figure there, right? And even at the end of Song of Myself, when he's saying, I'm large, I contain multitudes, he's looking past his death, right? He's looking to the future and people reading him and him moving beyond that. And the I sort of staying on as this construct that allows this vision to be communicated. And so Mayer is looking to herself. But unlike the sort of mannered sculpting of one's personal traumas, you think about, what's his name? It's not James Russell Lowell. It's the other Lowell. Robert Lowell. Robert Lowell's book, The Dolphin, where he carves up his ex-wife's letters and turns them into poems, right? In those moments, he's shaping his personal experience into a poem, yeah. But Mayer is looking at herself, looking at the poet as a kind of conduit who turns experience into poetry. She has this great quote somewhere about being able to dip a ladle or something like that into a stream of poetry and sort of dish up a poem, once you get yourself habituated to the language. And so she is trying to see how she can capture the fullness of the subject in poetry, and what a poetry that even attempted to capture everything would look like. And so throughout memory, there's this tension between the lyric present and memory, and we see this generally, right, in any lyric poetry. How do you write the thing at hand when writing always occurs at a remove? So in other words, you perceive something. You think about like Olson's perception on perception. You perceive something. You see a bird land in a tree, or you see, somebody ride a bicycle down the street or whatever. By the time you write that down, there's a remove. Yeah. And what you remember about it has already been processed. So we think about memory as being this kind of way that we access our experience, this sort of unmediated state. And so at first glance, we would probably think that our memory is less mediated, less affected than writing about something, because writing something down requires even further sort of confinement. You have to cast it into language. And so you have to sort of settle on a certain realm of potentialities that you're going to set in stone, and then other stuff gets left out. And you'll see in the preface, Mayer even talks about that. She's like, so many things are left out here. Yeah. But the thing is, our memory is unreliable, and sometimes it's irretrievable. Yeah, because the way that our brains work, they frequently, through the way that the brain processes information and takes it in, the brain doesn't keep everything, and it doesn't record everything. And if what it does record, it doesn't record everything where we can just access it. So in a way, even before we can write about our experience, our memory has already processed things and already foreclosed on certain potentialities. And our memory is shaped both by our perception and our mental state when perceiving, but is then also shaped by our remembering, right? And you can think about remembering as being both to recall something that you have in your memory, but also the putting back together of something, the putting the members back together, the reconstitution of something. And it's one of those things that the more you sort of go back to a memory and you recall it and you look at it, the greater the chance that it will achieve an even greater mutability, a plasticity, and that your remembering will shape it. And so Mayer is really interested in this line, right? How transparent can a poem be? And how can you get experience into a poem given all these different levels of mediation and processing and unreliability, right? And so there's this big overlap between poem and process and life that I think is not only really interesting to read and think about and look at the ways that Mayer approached this, because she doesn't do a literal moment-to-moment record. Right? She doesn't say, I went into the living room, I sat down, right? It's not a diary or a journal. I'll give you an example. I was curious about a source in something else I was reading, and so I looked up this diary by a planter in Virginia in the 1750s. And his diary is fascinating because each entry is about roughly a sentence long, and every entry starts with him declaring what the weather was that day, right? But in very terse terms. So each entry will have like a number for the day. It'll be like 2, and it'll say clear and warm, and then it'll say something like letter received from so-and-so. And then the next day, if the weather was the same, he'll be like ditto, and then he'll write what's going on. And so there's a direct record there, but there's also something really poetic about it, this sort of texture of the weather and ditto and these minor happenings, these very limited things that he chooses to include. And so Mayer's record here, when she's looking at the things that happen over the course of this month, are not diaristic. So they're not attempting to record a blow-by-blow, step-by-step, schematic account of what happened, but rather they are trying to capture the experience of what happened, to recreate the sensory and emotional and intellectual and maybe even spiritual ways that these things felt like as they happened, right? But we'll notice as we go on that it's not a literal representation, not only in that it's not plotted out, but poetic things intrude on the writing of the text itself. And so sometimes it's the most poetic things that capture something of the texture of the experience. And so it's really important, I guess, here to say that while this has an autobiographical impulse, it's still not an autobiography. It's not transparent at all. And I don't think that it's really trying to be transparent per se. It's trying to go after a certain possibility and a certain effect, right? And so we should think about how that's achieved. Okay. So what I'm going to do in these two slides is I'm going to walk you through passages from memory. I've got two of them lined up that were they were moments that struck me as interesting for one way or the other, or for one thing or the other. But what I want to offer here is ways that you can pay attention to Mayer's language and start to think about how to process and understand this text, because it's an overwhelming text. It's very overwhelming. And one of the comparisons I want to make probably in our final week is between the way that texts like this proceed and the way that other language writing texts proceed in their sort of modularity. So in other words, that different parts can be put together in different ways, but also in their attempt to create open-ended texts, as Heginian refers to open texts in her rejection of closure. These texts that that might stop but don't end. And I want to think about how that relates to the form of the feed. So in other words, the main sort of aesthetic form of social media, which is this continuous feed. I was thinking about talking about it this week, but I want to do more reading and thinking before I make my first tentative stabs at that. So here in this moment, right, this is a moment from July 9th. So it's the second week of the month, okay? And so I'm going to read this to you, okay? And as I read it, I want you to, and I bolded some of the things here to help me keep track of things, because it's just a giant blob on the screen, right? But I want you to think about the way that this passage contains, and it's both, it ends in a period, there's a period here at the end, but it's also sort of a unit, because I think it starts the chapter and then it goes down, and then there's a place where she says place 2, which seems to suggest they moved to a different location, right? But I want to think about here the way that the text not only records the process of the poem emerging from this experience, but the way that casting of the experience and process into language also serves as a kind of meditation on memory. And so one of the ways that I think that Mayer does this is by looking for the way that experience itself offers images that readily take the place of metaphors. So you see things and you encounter things, and by encountering them and thinking about them, they take on a kind of poetic thickness, even though in that moment they themselves were just, stuff that was there, things that you encountered, right? That it's the process that sort of adds value to these things, right? To use a very neoliberal term, right? Okay, so I'm going to read it to you. What's the difference who's in charge? When our experience is increased by the addition of observations which were future, down the road and reflections to infinity, but are now past, we seek once more to order in the same manner our increased volume of experience. When it's this bright, it's just as well to look at them small. How can you see that? But in this increased volume, all experience is of equal value. That which was future, reflections to infinity, is in no way different from that which was past, for all is now past. When it's this bright, it's just as well to look at them small. Now can you see that? What are those? Are they trees or wildflowers? Down the road in reflections to infinity in the bathroom mirror. In order not to lose the light, you do it with a mirror. And the only way you can get a mirror there is when the shutters close, and never mind. And when this light goes on, this is the first or last. And those are the holes where birds lived where they live. I said, what's the difference who's in charge? The light says, the money says, the dawn says, desert. No, this is an incredible thing. Those are little holes that birds make to live in a mound of sand. It's in a gravel pit. I said, that's really strange. What kind of birds do that? She said, I have no idea because the sand is completely dry. And they must have to wet it some way, the way ants do when they build anthills, I said. It's in a gravel pit. It's not near water anywhere, is it? She said, no, it's in a gravel pit. It's a gravel pit in the middle of the Berkshires. I went there to get sand, I said. I wander all night in my vision, someone said. And I say, lie down on the road in the dark. Say, down on the road in reflections to infinity. Or down the road in reflections to infinity. In the mirror framed in a color on the wine dark road. It was green to my house, and I checked first the holes in a mountain of sand where birds nest, place, sand to make sandbags. And what were they for, she said. We shot a film in the middle of the river, and we put a tripod down, and we thought we might need sandbags, because the river runs its hard running water. But the holes, I couldn't believe it. And I took a picture of them, and then the guy at the gravel pit explains it, what they are, and you see the birds flying in and out, huge birds, and the big holes. They don't look it. You don't get any ideas of their size, I said. Pterodactyls or something, she said. Yes, birds with wings of skin and long fingers, I said. And she said, very prehistoric, really incredible, she said. Okay. So, one of the things that we'll note here, right, is that this section starts with a kind of philosophical statement on experience and memory, right? What's the difference? Who's in charge? Okay. When our experience is increased by the addition of observations which were future but are now past, we seek once more to order in the same manner our increased volume of experience, right? So she's saying our experience, when we experience something, our experience is increased because we make observations that are, what would be the word? Posterior to the experience, right? They're in the future. So we have the experience, then we move on. We have observations in the future, and they change the way that we understand our experience. And so the experience itself sort of grows because it accumulates context as we go on and other information. And so our actual initial experience is altered by the continuity or the continuous nature of our experience, right? And so we seek once more in the same manner our increased volume of experience. But in this increased volume, all experience is of equal value. That which was future is in no way different from that which was past, for all is now past. So everything sort of gets folded into this process. That which was future is now past. So we have an experience, we move on, so the experience is now in the past. The future provides more context for that experience, which changes that past experience. But then that future context, right, which is really in the present now, also moves into the past, and then itself accumulates, right? It increases in volume, as Mayer says, right? So one thing you'll note there is I skipped some of the parts as I was reading that. And one of the ways that Mayer's text invites reader participation is that in order to capture the overlapping nature of our experiences, the way that our thoughts and emotions and perceptions all sort of deluge us at all points at all times, she will fold into a coherent line of thought other thoughts. Sometimes they're related. Sometimes they are those additional contextual things, right? Sometimes they're sort of contrapuntal, right? They have sort of a sub thematic relation to what's going on the surface. But as you go through, it actually, you get in the habit of sort of piecing these things together, sort of seeing the asides and seeing the different connections. So one of the strategies that you can use is try to see where different parts of the discourse that she's laying out connect up with each other, different ways that the utterances she's creating have these different sort of fault lines throughout, right? So one of the things that you'll note here, though, is that as she's thinking about this idea, so we can take that, what's the difference, who's in charge, right? When our experience is increased, right? If we take this idea about experience and the accumulation of experience and how the temporality of experience and the way that memory functions and the way that we perceive our own memory alters our understanding of everything, we can start to see that maybe as kind of a thematic statement for this particular day, right? So as you read through July 9, you might think about, well, okay, does this idea hold the whole day together? Right. Another way to think about it is that these different statements that she'll make or reflections that she'll make operate in the same way as those sort of additional observations. They increase the volume of experience over the course of the text, but they also constitute a kind of meta thread within the experience, right? They foreground the questions that the pursuit of this poem raises. Right? So in other words, they're kind of a side effect of what's to hand, yeah? And so we can think about that as one part, and then there's the things that she is preceding, the bits of speech, the bits of observation, right? Down the road, reflections to infinity. It's just as well to look at them small. When it's bright, when it's this bright, it's just as well to look at them small. Now can you see that? We can see those, right? Like Pollock's cigarettes or O'Hara's pop culture, the different detritus of speech and communication and social interaction and relationships and relationship to place and environment and so on and so forth, getting folded into the poem, right? And then getting leavened by these additional observations, which then increase the volume of experience, right? Okay. So one of the things that I think is interesting here is the way that in remembering this day, memory gets figured, or we could argue that memory gets figured in a series of different things that come to hand in our observation, right? The first is these mirrors, right? Down the road and reflections to infinity, reflections to infinity. When it's bright, it's just as well to look at them small. Now can you see that? Down the road and reflections to infinity in the bathroom mirror. In order not to lose the light, you do it with a mirror. And the only way you can get a mirror there is when the shutters close and never mind, right? When this light goes on. So the mirror there is connected with light, with being able to see things. But it's connected with shutters as well, which both can be something that shuts out the light, like the shutters on a house, or it can be the shutter of a camera, which also shuts out the light, but is the thing that allows the image to develop, right? The shutter closes. I actually don't know how a camera works. I took photography, but that was mainly because in photography, the teacher didn't keep track of you and you didn't have to do anything. That was high school, right? But the shutter on a camera closes and you get the picture, right? Yeah, the shutter must close so the film can advance. So the mirrors here and the light and the shutting of the house and the bathroom mirror and the reflections to infinity, mirrors reflecting mirrors, in some ways, those are an image of memory. Yeah, then we think of memory as a mirror. But if we think about that idea of the experience increased by the addition of observations which were future, we could figure that by thinking about reflections to infinity, mirrors reflecting mirrors, and the way that as we remember and as we add to our experience, our memories change. And so the things that we think we've got a picture of, that we've replicated, we close the shutters, we have to open it up again to let the light in. And as we constantly let light in, we take more pictures. All we do is accumulate these reflections, right? This mirror that is reflecting to infinity. And so the mirror becomes not this simple reflection like we want the surface of a lyric poem to be. You want to read that confessional poem and be like, oh man, Sylvia Plath's dad was a Nazi, right? You want it to be a mirror. But what Mayer is saying is even here, where she's trying to get real experience in here, it's a mirror looking at mirrors. Everything is reflecting itself to infinity, right? Now, she doesn't come out and say that. It's through juxtaposition, yeah? She puts out that when our experience is increased by the additions of observations which are future, and then she attaches it to these repetitions of reflections to infinity in the bathroom mirror. In order not to lose the light, you do it with a mirror, right? In order not to lose the light, to try and capture something, even for a moment. I'm trying to look at the pictures near that day to see what she's got pictures of, right? You'll see that, like on 97, she's got pictures of the holes and the sand, but she also has these pictures of reflections, right? They're not mirrors, but there's a lake, there's a river, there's off a bridge, there's a darkness in the forest, little bits of light getting through. There's a reflection of something in, I'm not really sure what it is. It might be like some kind of pool or window or something. It's on page 101. More reflections on 102. And so one of the things, mirrors and reflections figure throughout this day, July 9, right? But the holes here, I would argue, are also part of this, right? Those are the holes where birds lived where they live. What's the difference who's in charge? The light says, the money says, the dawn says, desert. No, this is an incredible thing. Those are little holes that birds make to live. An amount of sand. It's in a gravel pit, right? No, it's a gravel pit. Down the road, and reflections to infinity. So the holes of the birds are sort of the focal point here that they discuss them. And the birds are attached both to living in this inhospitable environment. It's sand and it's a gravel pit and it's like a desert, right? We even get that word desert. And the birds are living where they live, right? They make these holes to live. These are the things that they make to live. And then you see the birds flying in and out, huge birds in their big holes. They don't look at you. You don't get any idea of their size, right? So the holes are something that you observe both in the photographs in memory, but also in the text itself. They are made for the birds to live in, and the birds come in and out of them, right? So it's this sense of domesticity, but in this inhospitable landscape, yeah? And not only that, but it's these holes, the size of them it says they don't look at, you don't get any ideas of their size, right? So your perspective makes it difficult to capture exactly what you're seeing. You see holes, but she explains they're holes that birds live in and that the birds made them, right? And that she went there to get sand. And then, so obviously the birds are moving around sand. They're living in the mound of sand. But here, right, the holes in some way sort of echo the reflections to infinity, this sense of a depth and a failure of perspective, right? You can't tell if they're large or small. You can't really tell. There's nothing to compare, right? There's nothing to offer a sense of perspective. There's nothing in the image, and even when you look at the images of the holes in the sand mound, there's nothing to tell you the size of those holes. There's nothing you could really calculate it by, right? And so there's a sense there, both in the mirror as being this ostensibly surface thing that actually has this like sinister infinite depth, right? Just like memory. But also the way that even when you capture something precisely, you take a photograph of it, you write it down, there's a sense of perspective that's lost. There's something lost that you cannot capture, right? And so that's both this negative image, a hole, right? Which is a thing that you're looking at the absence of the sand, the absence of the gravel. You have to believe her and believe the guy at the gravel pit that birds come in and out of them and that birds live there. But also this way that as you go back in your memory and as you go back in time and you look in these reflections which have changed over time, there's a sense of perspective that's lost. Right. She even goes back, all the way in time to the pterodactyls, right? Very prehistoric, really incredible. This sense of ancient, deep time, right? Similarly, echoing the memory mirrors holes bit, right, is the emphasis on roads, down the road, right, which is this sort of gesture towards futurity. The addition of observations which were future, down the road. So they're down the road, and reflections to infinity. And so the phrase down the road in its first couple of iterations is connected to reflections to infinity. It's sort of this future-oriented thing. The road goes on, down the road. But when you say something's down the road, you're also indicating that you're in a certain position and that there's this promised space, right? It's both spatial and temporal, that away from here there is something, right? But down the road eventually changes to, I wander all night in my vision, someone said, and I say, lie down on the road in the dark, say down on the road, right? Lie down on the road in the dark. To lie down on the road, so down on the road, attempts to fix with more specificity a place on this endless, or at least theoretically or imagistically endless band, right? The road as a feed going in either direction, and to lie down on the road is to attempt to stick something to a particular moment, to attach it to a particular place, right? And then she on the wine dark road, and wine dark is a word that echoes the Greek epics and the sea, right? So the road here takes on in that epithet not only an epic sense in the way that things like the Odyssey is really, a giant road trip, a trying to go home, a trying to stay in a single place, but never, or get back to a point of stability and never quite getting there. But also this sense of the road as a kind of ocean, like a reflection to an infinity, this thing that rolls on and on and on and on and on and just keeps going. Right? And so you'll notice a counterpoint here between the road and the mirror and memory, right? And the holes reflect memory, but they're also where something lives. They're like a house. They're a point, right, in a particular place. And similarly with the sandbags, just like the birds have removed sand to make their homes in this hill, she went there to get sand, to make sandbags, these things to stabilize. They want to film in the middle of a river, and the river runs hard. The river, again, being imagistically related to the road, which is related to mirrors, which is related to memory, right? And the sandbags as this point of stability, right? But even then, there's this sense that it's temporary, just like the birds, right? They have to have some way to wet it, like ants do when they build ant hills, right? It's not near water. So I said temporal distinctions here, right? So one of the things I think is that I was talking about with that when I made this last night, this PowerPoint, is there's moments in here where she says, where she wanders back and forth between the past and the present, right, and the future. I said, I wander all night. It was green to my house. It's hard running water. Then the guy at the gravel pit explains it, what they are. And so in this constant shifting back and forth, right? She's getting back to that initial question about experience and observations which were in the future and the increased volume of experience. The way that our temporality of experience is difficult to connect to. We could say all these things are in the past, but doing that, we lose some of that perspective. We don't get any idea of their size, right? Their relative distance. They're down the road, right? But where? How far down the road? That can be 10 feet, that can be 10 miles. And so a couple of things that we might take away here is one of the ways to approach the text is to think about it as having a fugue-like aesthetic quality. So there's repetition. Phrases are repeated and they take on significance through their repetition, but also through their proximity to other language, right? So the memory is related to the mirrors, to the holes, to the roads, to the river, to the sandbags, all because they not only are repeated, but then they're brought into dialogue with each other, right? They're placed next to each other, okay? Motif is another important thing. So here throughout this passage and throughout parts of this day, she develops these ideas of reflections to infinity and roads and mirrors and reflections, and it's taken up in the photographs, and then it's taken up in other sections, and it pops up in other places, sometimes in the same language, sometimes in new language. So it's a development of theme that in some ways is more musical than anything else, right? And if we think about music as things happening in time over a course of a period of time at a variety of intensities, there is something very musical about this, right? It's also textural, and so you can look at texture and the way that the repetition of language really sort of pretty quickly starts building this poetic thickness around certain words and images and places, and think about how that texture is then complicated or opened up even in some cases by the photographs, right? Think about the quality of the language, okay? But remember that it's not a literal representation, okay? This involves a conversation that she had. It involves a place she went. It involves things that they were thinking about, talking about, things that she was perceiving as she was writing this, and accessing her memory, right? But it's not a literal blow by blow, this is what happened, this is what happened. It was clear and warm, ditto, right? It's not that, okay? So you have to approach it as something that in some ways, despite its intense quotidian nature, is also much more intensely poetic in some ways than some of the stuff that we've read even to this point. Okay. So now I want to sort of talk about a passage from memory in a different register. In the last one, I was speaking more formally and trying to get you to see the kinds of aesthetic connections between things. But here I want to talk about some of the thematic issues that appear in different parts of the text. So in this particular instance, what I'm interested in is the way that memory frequently foregrounds not only issues of representation, which we saw in the last passage too, but also technology. This is a very technologically advanced poem for 1971. They're using tape recorders. They're using a heck of a lot of film. She's taking a whole roll of film. That's like 30 pictures a day. And I know for some of you, you're like, what? But let me tell you, that's an endeavor, right? The film, was pretty expensive. You had to pay to get it developed too. And to take a whole roll every day involves even though it's 30 pictures, really in the scope of things, that's not a whole lot, yeah? And so it takes a sort of deliberate thinking through what you're going to take a photo of and then trying to, get that shot. And so the poem itself is enmeshed with all these technologies. And when it was exhibited, technology was still at the forefront. It was placed in a gallery, but the photos were all lined up along the wall. A tape of Mayer reading the text was played in a loop over it. I think it would have taken like 8 hours or something like that to stand there and absorb the whole thing, right? So technology is important, okay? So I'm going to read you this passage, and then we're going to talk about the way that this theme picks up some important aspects of the text. We parked on a downtown street to stop at another store, maybe Fifth Avenue this time. I can't remember. No, we were just around the corner on 7th, near Pennsylvania Station, and I was looking at windows again. No luck. Just drifters. So we went uptown to Bloomingdale's to check that place out and record some street noise. There it was, a really clear day, but there wasn't enough traffic to make the noise level boom, and Bloomingdale's noise was fine, except they didn't have, and neither did any of the other stores. They didn't have those bells you remember hearing, the bells called floor bells, ringing like the bell at the end of the line, but more resonant. So we stopped where we were at 3rd and 60th for quite some time, recording cars passing with a long boom. Sometime goes by in car. Some guy thinks our booms are a Geiger counter, and we're at Niagara Falls waiting for the traffic to build up at the lights. There's a big Schlitz ad. It reads, "Reach for the gusto in life," and all the familiar pancake buildings. And I wonder how Carol, that fainted, is. She was nervous, and when we saw her, what the fuck, somebody starts playing the drum solo out across the street. It sounds like trashing. And I see more people on bicycles, and while I'm looking, Ed's answering questions about his machine. Is it a 3 or a 4? This guy really knows what he's talking about. It ain't no Geiger counter. The Niagara is made in Switzerland, yes. So we did all we could with department stores and traffic, and then we went to Daly's, and Daly's ain't there anymore either, to record some bar noise, but they serve too much food, and it's always crowded. Turned out we couldn't use their noise at all, because you could hear the sound of frying in the background, and the TV was on, I think, but we had a good beer, and then we went to a Horn and Hardert's lunch counter to see if we could get good restaurant noise, music and all. Now this Horn and Hardert's noise turned out pretty well, except again for the intermittent frying and sizzle noise, but the music was great, and so was the clinking. And I had iced coffee, and Ed had a Coke, and we shared a grilled cheese, or maybe I ate the cheese sandwich and Ed had a piece of pie. Anyway, they treated us pretty well in there and didn't complain about the tape recorder. And there were a lot of people eating dinner, assorted dinner, including one priest who sat right down next to us. He ain't afraid of no Geiger counter. And these people eating dinner again looked like the people in the market. It seemed to me they must have had a regular schedule to live on, which included dinner at Horn and Hardert's, a place with an old reputation, every day, or at least every Saturday, or at least every July 3rd. Okay? All right. So a couple of things here, right, that I think are interesting. One is that this particular passage foregrounds the process of memory in producing the text. So again, the process of the text comes through. Maybe Fifth Avenue this time, I can't remember. No, we were just around the corner, right? Or she says, we shared a grilled cheese. Or maybe I ate the cheese sandwich and Ed had a piece of pie anyway. Yeah. So there's these moments where the remembering comes into the text, right? They didn't have those bells you remember hearing. But here, the foregrounding of memory is a little bit different than the way it was, or the way that it is further in the book when we get to the last passage we talked about. Because here, the unreliability of memory is foregrounded in a pretty straightforward way. She can't remember exactly where they were. And so she includes the process of trying to sort that out. We parked on a downtown street to stop, another store, maybe Fifth Avenue this time, I can't remember. No, we were just around this corner on 7th near Pennsylvania Station. I was looking at windows again. And so one of the things that's interesting there is by having that, or having the grilled cheese, or maybe I ate the cheese sandwich and Ed had a piece of pie, is in her effort to remember, she includes both what she eventually decides is maybe the right memory, as well as the thing that was the inaccurate memory. Yeah. So in order to fully represent the memory process, she has to also represent misremembering. And that becomes a part of the texture of the text because it calls into question all the different definitive statements that she made by revealing that any memory is, in a way, a decision to privilege a certain aspect of one's memory over another, or a certain thing in it over another. Yeah. So another way that gets enacted here is through their recording noise, which is they're trying to record some street noise and some restaurant noise. And it's similar in the way that Mayer recorded herself and produced memory as a text, right? Now, the thing that's interesting here is that as they try to get the restaurant noise and the store noise and the traffic noise, they aren't able to get the noise the way that they want. So they go to record some street noise, but there's not enough traffic to make the noise level boom. Yeah. So when they're recording the street noise, they're literally recording it, but there's not enough traffic to make that noise register as street noise. So even though the recording would literally be the noise of the street at that moment, it's not the right noise or isn't enough noise to register as street noise to someone else. Yeah. And so they go and they try to make these, the Bloomingdale's noise was fine, but none of the stores had the bell that Mayer wanted. She wanted this bell included. The bell's called floor bells, ringing like the bell at the end of the line, but more resonant. I'm not really sure what that is. But the bells you remember hearing. She wanted her recording of the noise of the store to recreate a memory that she had, but then the noise didn't have that thing. So again, even though the noise was accurate technically, it didn't capture what she was going for. It didn't include what she wanted or what she remembered hearing, right? And so you'll see the same thing like when they're waiting for traffic to build up. So they're waiting for a particular situation in order to capture it technologically, to put it on the tape, right? And you'll notice the restaurant noise is the best example of this, right? They go to record some bar noise, but they serve too much food and it's always crowded. Turned out we couldn't use their noise at all because you could hear the sound of frying in the background and the TV was on, I think, right? So again, foregrounding memory. But we had a good beer and then we went to Horn and Hardett's lunch counter to see if we could get good restaurant noise, muzak and all. Turned out pretty well, except again for the intermittent frying and sizzle noise, but the muzak was great and so was the clinking, okay? So the restaurant noise that they're trying to capture ideally does not include all the noise of a restaurant. It includes certain things, but not other things. They want a recording of that noise that isn't the whole picture, right? So one of the things that's interesting here is the way that by focusing on technology, the same technology that is being used to produce memory as a text, it reveals the ways in which even attempts at authenticity, attempts to include everything, necessarily fall short without some intervention. The noise does not register as restaurant noise unless it has certain things and not other things. The traffic noise doesn't register as traffic noise unless it has certain sounds. So in other words, you can't use the literal sound of traffic or the literal sound of the restaurant to represent those things if the noise isn't something that someone's already decided should be in that noise, right? Like the bells. And so what this calls into question is, in what way do we recognize things in a text? And in what way do we understand representations of things? And why is it, Mayer seems to be fiddling with, why is it that our representations of things so frequently rely on extraordinary circumstances or rely on a particular intensity of a kind of circumstance or event and not the actual range of possibilities within there? And so one of the things that you might keep track of throughout the book is all these different moments. There's bells and tape recorders and bicycles and ovens and muzak. Keep track of the ways that technology gets represented in the text, but also the way that technology as a mediating representational force plays a role in the construction of the text's meaning.